Everyone, and welcome. We're so pleased to have so many people be able to come out and join us on this beautiful day for this beautiful event in our beautiful sanctuary here. We have a special guest with us today. We're so fortunate. She's a former member of Mountainside Master Chorale, and she has a gorgeous voice. We really wish she would be up here singing with us, actually. But she's quite a well-known personality on KUSC. Jennifer Miller Hammel. She's here to tell us a lot about Mozart and what we are about to sing. Jennifer.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Are you excited to hear one of the great cornerstones of classical music this afternoon? Awesome. Well, yes, I am a former member of this lovely group that you see behind me and in front of me. I see a few friendly, familiar faces down here. I absolutely enjoyed my time with Mountainside Master Chorale, and I'm absolutely thrilled that I can be back here today talking about this incredible piece with you. Now, this afternoon's performance features, again, as I was saying, one of those great cornerstones of choral music, Mozart's dramatic final work, his Requiem. So how many of you have heard this work before? Okay, so a lot of you. Okay, now the other question. How many of you have sung this piece before? Okay, well, yeah, people in the Mountainside will be, of course. So this is a work that is steeped in as much mystery and controversy as it is honored and lauded. And as history tells us, he left it unfinished. So how exactly did it get completed, and who was responsible for its completion? There is one person who may truly know the answer to that question, but instead of presenting the truth, they spent the years following Mozart's death perpetuating several great half-truths and even some bold-faced lies. One of the greatest mysteries in all of Western classical music was created due to the deliberate but warranted obfuscation of one person. Sounds like a case for Mulder and Scully, right? So, who here has that one friend, or perhaps a family member, who can't just tell a story, right? They are trying to tell you about going to the grocery store or perhaps going down to the street to get a cheeseburger, and then it becomes this whole epic adventure of fighting ninjas and dealing with traffic, and then the phone wouldn't work, their debit card got lost, and everything just becomes completely sensationalized. I hate to admit it, but I actually might be that person to some of my friends because I tell stories for a living. So here's what we do know for certain about the story of the Requiem. Mozart was approached by the delightfully named Count Wolfgang Stupach. Yeah, I love it. I'm just going to go around saying that all afternoon now. Count Wolfgang Stupach to create a Requiem Mass for his recently deceased wife. The Count promised a commission fee of 100 ducats. So I did the math for you. That's about $13,000, $14,000 today. Half paid up front and half when it was finished. Now the Count was known for commissioning works, and then he would later claim them as his own, which was probably his intent with this Requiem Mass that he asked Mozart to write. Now, the commission was delivered through a mysterious messenger who came to Mozart's home in the summer of 1791. While stories would paint this stranger as a masked man in gray, or even Antonio Salieri in disguise, and I'll get to more about that later, it was in reality Count Wolfgang's valet, a guy by the name of Anton Leitgeb. Mozart initially wanted to decline the offer as he was in the midst of several big projects, a couple little operas called The Magic Flute and La Clemenza di Tito. And his health was starting to seriously decline, but money always rules the day. When Leitgeb offered 50% of that fee up front, Mozart had to say yes, because, well, let's just say things were not financially going so well for the Mozart family at that time. He would complete the opening two movements you will hear this afternoon, the dramatic introit with its bursts of golden light and the colorful fugues of the Kyrie. In late November of 1791, Mozart's battle with kidney disease took a turn, which forced him to go to bed and remain there. A week later, he would be gone. He was just 35 years old. He had started sketches for the remainder of the Requiem Mass, but was unable to complete it. This left his commission to Walsegg unfinished and potentially leaving Mozart's widow Constanze in a bit of a financial pickle. Would she have to return the 50-ducat advance they had already received, or would she be able to convince the Count that it was finished as to receive the rest of the fee? How would she be able to fool the Count? There was one solution. Ask one of her late husband's students to finish the piece, and then pass it off to the Count as Mozart's own work. And no one, not one person who had knowledge of this plan could ever tell the truth. It's a big secret. Now, Mozart met singer Constanze Weber, who, yes, is the cousin of composer Carl Maria von Weber, in 1777, when Mozart came to stay with the family. Although he was initially attracted to Constanze's older sister, Aloysia, by 1781, he only had eyes for Constanze. Mozart was living in the boarding house that the Weber family was running in Vienna, and Constanze's mother, of course, immediately asked Mozart to leave when she discovered the relationship between the composer and her daughter. I mean, you would as well, right? Mozart's father, Leopold, also had some pretty deep reservations about the match. First of all, Mozart having a relationship being a distraction, first and foremost, but telling his son in letters that Constanze was not a good partner for his talented son. Mozart would respond with high praises for his beloved, complimenting her simple beauty and her ability to make her own clothes and do her own hair. I'm sure she had that on her dating profile. Constanze was well educated. She spoke 3 languages fluently and was a musician herself. Certainly a good match for Mozart, right? Now, despite his father's objections, Mozart married Constanze in Vienna in the summer of 1782, and as luck would have it, the day after their wedding, a letter would arrive in the mail with Leopold approving of the marriage. So everything worked out in the end. Their marriage was happy, from all accounts, though they lived beyond their means and were frequently running up debts and barely able to pay their bills. The couple had 2 sons that lived past infancy, adding to their costs, of course. So when Mozart died in 1791, Constanze feared she would not be able to make ends meet due to their crippling debt. So she immediately reached out to Mozart's colleague and former student, Austrian composer Joseph Eibler. So this is candidate number 1. Eibler was praised as one of the greatest musical geniuses in Vienna, next to Mozart, of course. Eibler was a well-educated musician from a very musical family. He had gained the approval of Joseph Haydn, the guy who wrote all the symphonies, and he introduced Eibler to Mozart around 1789. Mozart was so impressed with Eibler that he let the young composer study with him and even run a rehearsal of the opera Così fan tutte. In 1790, Mozart had this to say about his colleague and friend: "I attest herewith that I have found Herr Joseph Eibler to be a well-grounded composer, equally skilled at chamber music and the church style, fully experienced in the art of the song, also an accomplished organ and piano player. In short, a young musician such one can only regret, as so seldom has his equal." That's high praise from Mozart. Eibler would be at Mozart's bedside during the latter's final days, helping to care for his friend alongside Constanze. So when Constanze approached Eibler to, anonymously, of course, finish the Requiem, I have to imagine that task was pretty daunting. How would you feel, the wife of your friend, your mentor, coming up to you and say, hey, I need you to finish this work for me and not tell a soul? So this is what he would have to do. He'd have to flesh out the middle sections that you'll hear today, the sequence, which includes the Dies Irae and the Lacrimosa, as well as the offertory and the Sanctus. And then Eibler would have to fully compose the Benedictus, the Agnus Dei, and the final movement, the Communion, which includes the Lux Aeterna. Original music from his imagination in the style of his friend. Okay, so no big deal at all, right? Just pretend to be one of the most beloved composers of the 18th century and hope no one figures out it was you that wrote the balance of this mass. So Eibler set to work cleaning up what Mozart had written out of the orchestrations of the first two movements. And in the end, couldn't bring himself to finish the piece. Now, historians debate if it was the weight of the task that scared Eibler, but more than likely it was because he had too much respect for his late friend to pretend to be him. Also, in a very interesting footnote to Eibler's involvement with the Requiem, he would later land the position of Kapellmeister in the court of Empress Maria Theresia. So he was in charge of all the music that would be performed in the court. Eibler would frequently feature Mozart's works on his concert, and in 1833 stepped up to the podium to lead a performance of the very same Requiem he was asked to complete. Now, unfortunately, he would suffer a stroke during the performance and would have to leave behind his musical career in the court. But all was not lost, as just 2 years later, he would be raised to nobility as a thank you for his time working for the Empress. Found that very interesting. So, when Eibler said, I can't do this, Costanza reached out to another one of her late husband's students, Franz Süssmayr. Süssmayr would gain a reputation as one of the most popular Austrian composers of his day. He settled in Vienna, opening a musical studio. He would become acquainted with Mozart in the years leading up to the latter's death. Süssmayr was another great talent who worked closely with Mozart, probably assisting in the completion of many of the works that Mozart was working on in his final days. In fact, historians think he probably wrote all of the recitative in Mozart's The Clemency of Titus, La Clemenza di Tito, as Mozart himself was too ill to finish a lot of that work. And this is why Süssmayr had no qualms about working on the Requiem. In fact, on top of the Clemency of Titus, he had already completed several other smaller unfinished works of Mozart's as to help with Costanza's financial debts. She was able to take those works, say, my husband wrote these in completion, and sell them for the money. Süssmayr would build upon what Eibler had already done on the Requiem, while also taking inspiration from Mozart's other sacred works to create what you will hear this afternoon. He would reuse phrases from earlier in the work for later movements, something Mozart was not known to do, and would even take passages from works such as Mozart's 1776 Sparrow Mass. Süssmayr would claim that Mozart left him detailed instructions on how it was to be finished, but no proof of this was ever found. Was Süssmayr ever given credit in his lifetime for the work he did? Probably not. Did he get paid for it? Probably not. So, the questions still stand. Even with a ghost composer in place, how could Costanza convince Count Walsegg that this epic work was completed by her husband in the weeks before his death? And how to maintain that story as part of Mozart's legacy so she could continue to receive the royalties from its performance and publication? And on top of that, make sure Mozart received all the credit at risk of Count Walsegg claiming the work was his own. So here's where the tall tales begin. In her letters, Costanza tells a story about scraps of paper that Süssmayr found on Mozart's desk, which left detailed instructions on how the Mass should be completed. Now, these scraps were never found, which casts doubt on her story. In another outlandish tale, She claimed Mozart knew his death was coming, as if he had seen the figure of death itself, and wanted to write the Requiem to be performed at his own funeral. A macabre but fascinating story that also proved very much not to be true. The tall tale only becomes taller in the decades following Mozart's death. Costanza would meet with several biographers to share her husband's story and the story of the Requiem. Stories that she could not even keep straight. In one meeting, she claimed her husband didn't know who it was that had commissioned the work, while in another, he knew who it was, but then couldn't predict on when it would be finished. Costanza herself would also claim that she never knew who asked for the work, while history would show she certainly did. Stories began to surface, thanks of course to Costanza, of how Mozart frequently worked himself to exhaustion while writing the Requiem, even asking for the score to be brought to his bed after he could no longer stand. Divine voices would sing melodies to him. He believed he was cursed to finish the Requiem, that the energy to complete the work would drain all that he had, and it would be the final and biggest thing he would ever do. Now, the biggest myth, which I must address thanks to a very popular movie, involves Mozart's contemporary Antonio Salieri, whom I mentioned a little bit earlier. For many years, a story circled that Salieri was involved in Mozart's death, but then sat at his bedside, helping him to complete the Requiem in the hours prior to the composer's death. Now, while this makes for a dramatic, fascinating story, it was certainly not true. Salieri was an older contemporary of Mozart's. The two frequently competed for the same positions, same commissions, same audience. And while there's no evidence to prove the two were bitter enemies, like a certain film would have you believe, they certainly were not the best of friends. Salieri's music was popular, but old-fashioned for the time, owing more to earlier composers like Gluck and Domenico Cimarosa, while Mozart was always forward-thinking. However, Mozart initially had a difficult time establishing his career in Vienna and blamed the popularity of Italian music and Salieri in particular for this, even going so far as to accuse Salieri of professional trickery. Ironic, considering the trickery we're exploring today. He would frequently lose to Salieri in competitions and could never seem to best the older composer. But Salieri did have great respect for his younger colleague. He would often revive Mozart's operas and perform his sacred works. After Mozart's death, Salieri, along with another composer by the name of Miller Hammel, would give composition lessons to Mozart's youngest son, a composer by the name of Franz Xaver Mozart. In 1832, Russian playwright Pushkin would present his sensationalized take on the relationship between the two composers in his play Mozart and Salieri, and how the latter could have caused the former's death. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov would turn it into an opera about 60 years later, and it would go on to inspire the play and Oscar-winning film, yes, Amadeus. But no, historians can confirm Salieri did not commission the Requiem in disguise, poison Mozart, nor have a change of heart and help him complete the Requiem in his final hours. Now, aside from the film Amadeus, the Requiem has also appeared in numerous film and television projects. In fact, the Lacrimosa became the basis for Evanescence's 2006 hit of the same name. I might have been blasting it on my way here. And last fall, developer Hoplite Research released their newest video game called Mozart Requiem, which ties the events of the premiere of Don Giovanni to Mozart's last days and the writing of his final mass. Interesting topic for a video game, I think. Well, no matter the stories that Costanza Mozart told in the decades following her husband's death, one thing is certain. she created one of the most complex and fascinating legends in classical music, one that certainly secured her financial independence, completely fooling Count Walsegg with the Süssmayr completed work, and cementing her husband's legacy as one of the most colorful composers of all time. She would present a benefit performance of the work before the Count could, making sure Mozart took all the credit and not one note of it going to Walsegg. Its first notable public performance would be in 1809 during the funeral of Joseph Haydn. Perhaps Beethoven said it best. When asked his thoughts on who really completed the Requiem, he answered, quote, "If Mozart did not write the music, the man who wrote it was a Mozart." I'm Jennifer Miller Hammel of Classical California KUSC. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon for this little mystery. And of course, thank you so much for supporting the Mountainside Master Chorale and this afternoon's performance of the Mozart or Süssmayr Requiem. Thank you so much.